Hello, my name is Brian Terry, and I'm a Senior Solution Architect at Amazon Web Services. And thank you for attending this session entitled Combining Partner Products with CloudFormation. I am so excited today to speak to you about CloudFormation. CloudFormation has always been one of my favorite services. My gosh, I've been using CloudFormation for many years, and it's always been my favorite. And it's always helped me to define my infrastructure as code in a reusable fashion. And I always love kind of building things as a software engineer, but I'm also kind of dev-centric in so to speak. So I like kind of messing around with servers and infrastructure and stuff. So writing infrastructure as code has always been one of my passions. So in this talk today, first thing I'm going to do is just talk a little bit about the benefits and overview of CloudFormation and what the service does. And then we're going to get into the CloudFormation Registry. And next, we're going to talk about modules, followed by AWS resource types. And then I'm going to give you an exciting demo on the new feature, which is called modules. And finally, we'll wrap it up at the end. So let's begin by talking about infrastructure as code. What exactly is that? Well, if we're looking at the CloudFormation service, basically, you have a JSON or YAML document that describes your infrastructure. So there's one document you can describe a three-tier architecture, a database. Anything you can possibly think of can be described in YAML or in JSON. You take that document and then you upload it to S3, and this is kind of done automatically if you're using the AWS CloudFormation console. And then it's used to create a stack. Now, a stack in CloudFormation is a CloudFormation template that, when you run it, it creates a stack of resources. So if we're thinking about the three-tier architecture model, you can basically create a JSON document describing that three-tier architecture, and that is comprised of a stack. So when you deploy that in CloudFormation, it creates all this infrastructure at one time. And then once these stacks are created, these resources are provisioned, and they're completely managed through CloudFormation. So if you update this infrastructure as you do with JSON documents or YAML documents, it updates your infrastructure when you apply the update in CloudFormation. This allows you to create a version control system around your infrastructure. And if you're a developer or have done any development work, being able to version your code is very important. And with CloudFormation, it can be very important and very helpful for you to do that too. So we talked a little bit about CloudFormation and how you can define your infrastructure in JSON and YAML. However, there are other ways to create this document. There are things such as high-level languages, creating micros and transforms and using custom resources. But at the end of the day, all these things compile into a JSON or YAML document. Again, this document can be stored in any version control system, and you can control it, and you can have some kind of monitoring around it too, in which you have on like editing, to say to speak. So when we talk about the other ways to create these CloudFormation templates, one of the things that may come to your mind is the CDK. Well, yeah, the CDK can help you define these CloudFormation templates. What that is just another layer of abstraction on top of building a template. It allows you to use higher level languages to create these JSON and YAML documents. And once you have that, you can submit it to CloudFormation and you can just create your resources, and your infrastructure can be provisioned in the CloudFormation. So that's the basics of CloudFormation today, and the simple down version of what CloudFormation is and how you can kind of use it. Now let's talk a little bit about extending it and some of the new features in CloudFormation. So the first thing I want to talk about is the CloudFormation Registry. I am so excited about this new feature. What the CloudFormation Registry allows you to do is to create items like custom resources or modules, which we'll see a little bit in this presentation, and be able to store those in a central location and be able to use those within your organization. So if you go to the CloudFormation console and you go to resource types, you will see there are a number of different resource types there that are public. But then there's also a drop-down inside that drop-down that gives you access to the private types. And what these private types are, are essentially private resources inside your AWS account. And these are regional based and they're account based. And you can actually use these the same way as you would any native CloudFormation service. So it allows you to register these types as private types and then reuse them throughout your organization. So some of the benefits to the customers are a centralized mechanism for distribution. They're available to use in all AWS CloudFormation templates in the account and region which they were imported. And finally, you can register third-party providers. So you as a partner can create these third-party providers and allow your customers to be able to use those in their accounts. Say, for instance, if you create a provider that's essentially a front end for your APIs, your customers can leverage those customer resources to provision anything, to use that as a control plane and provision that, and allow them to provision anything as far as one of your services. So if you, for example, if you have a SaaS offering and you're managing users, well, you can create a resource around that, right? So you can create a user resource and allow your customers to use this resource in CloudFormation to provision users on your platform. And the process is really simple on making these resources. So essentially start out as code. So basically you use the CloudFormation CLI and you generate a boilerplate template of creating a resource. And we'll see a little bit of this when we look at the module a little later on in this presentation. Finally, you submit that resource. Again, when you submit these resources, they're in the specific account and the region that you register these. So if you register them in the US East 1, that resource is only available in US East 1, so you would have to go back and re-register this in US East 2. Finally, you deploy the resource. So using a CloudFormation template, you can use these resources, and your customers can, in their template as though they were standard AWS resources. So if you wanted to extend an AWS resource, that's totally possible. So you can have your company S3 bucket. Same way you have the native AWS bucket, which is AWS S3 bucket. So now we've talked a little bit about the registry. Let's talk a little bit about modules. And I'm really excited about AWS modules. So what are modules? Well, modules are, I like to think of as reusable snippets of CloudFormation in such a way that you can share those within your organization. So going from left to right, if you're a publishing module, you would start with your inner domain expert or the CloudFormation community on best practices to define infrastructure. So again, if you were defining a 3-tier architecture and you wanted to publish this as a module, basically you would create this CloudFormation snippet in the best practices which you think should be within your organization. Next, you publish that module to the CloudFormation Registry. As I spoke about before, the registry is a central place to hold these custom resources and providers, and modules are one of these. And once you publish those to the CloudFormation Registry, end users can use these to create infrastructure in their own CloudFormation templates. So if you've got a developer that knows a little bit about CloudFormation, but wants to be able to use this 3-tier architecture without having to go back and re-architect that consistent piece of infrastructure in CloudFormation, they can essentially use this module inside their template. So let's dig a little deep and see what that kind of looks like. So on left, the developer creates a standard CloudFormation template in which they have a resource A and a resource B, and they have a module. Say this module is that 3-tier architecture. When that CloudFormation template is submitted to CloudFormation, that module is broken out into its underlying resources. So when that developer creates that CloudFormation template, they didn't have to go back and try to design that 3-tier architecture. They just used it because they found this in their registry and it was vetted, and this is the standard pattern for creating that. And they were just able to use that without having to recreate this. So as a partner, you can actually see how powerful this is, right? You can create modules that are in the best practices of deploying your product on AWS. And you can give this to your end user customer, and they can just use this as a module. Say, for instance, if your product takes advantage of any of our resources like load balancers or SQS queues or Kinesis, you can combine that into one reusable module that the customers can use to provision when they're creating their CloudFormation template, saving them a lot of time and effort in deploying your solution on AWS. So I want to take this and dig a little bit deeper, and let's take a look at the CloudFormation itself. So on the left, you can actually see the fragment of code or CloudFormation snippet. This essentially is a module. And again, a module can be a snippet of CloudFormation template. There is no restriction on that. So once you create that snippet, it is generated into a schema. And we'll look a little bit at the schema a little bit when I show the demo. But essentially, it's transformed into a schema that's reusable and extensible within inside CloudFormation. So now we've seen what modules are and how they're used and the benefits that you can, and talked a little bit about the benefits. Let's talk a little bit about module access. Sorry. So you can modify a module's input parameters. So when you have a module, again, this is a standard CloudFormation template. It can include parameters, resources, metadata, etc. So you can modify the module's input parameters. They also can use the ref function within inside CloudFormation. The get@, function attribute also works with the module. However, you can't modify resource or properties inside that module. Now you can update that. The end user can update that. You can update that module, but you can't modify the existing one. So now that we've talked a little bit about modules, let's talk a little bit about CloudFormation resource types. So CloudFormation resource types are a lot like modules. When we saw that modules, you define this reusable block of CloudFormation template, and you submit this to the CloudFormation registry. Now with resource types, these are essentially custom resource types, and they act and are used very similar to native CloudFormation resources. So I'm going to begin by talking a little bit about where you can find the CloudFormation CLI. So the CloudFormation CLI is the essential tool in registering and creating these boilerplate templates of these modules and resource types. So you can find that at the GitHub repository, because CloudFormation has made every effort to make this documentation known, and it's also open source, so you can actually see how this is made. So basically, you install the CloudFormation CLI on your computer, and it's a starting point for creating these resource types and modules. So within that CloudFormation CLI encompasses a core library. So with these resource types, you can create those in Java, Python, and Go. And using the CLI quickly builds scaffolding for these projects. It helps with code generation, it helps with local testing, validation of your schema, and it helps you submit the resource. And additionally, the CloudFormation enables you to register these resources in CloudFormation. Again, these are in the account and region in which you specify. So let's dig a little deeper into what these resource types look like. So on the left, you'll see a standard AWS CloudFormation resource, AWS EC2 instance, and has properties. On the right, you can see a CloudFormation custom resource type, and this could be any name, and it can have any kind of property that you define within your schema. So this allows you to create these resources that look, that feel, that act like native AWS CloudFormation resources. So these can be a front for your API. So again, going back to the example, I talked a little bit about creating that user resource. Well, this can be your company, : user resource, in which this creates users on your platforms. It deletes users on your platform. You perform all those CRUD applications by implementing the handlers inside this resource. So now that we looked at modules and we talked a little bit about CloudFormation resource types and the registry, let's talk a little bit about the additions to CloudFormation that have been made over the last year. So some of the additions are automatic support for config. So what does that look like? Well, basically, when you create these custom resource types, they can be tracked in config, just like native AWS resources. This allows you to have config rules around it, being able to see when these resources change. This allows you to, this automatically gives you a layer of governance over these resources that are created by your resources. We've also enabled drift detection for these resources. So if these resources go out of band, drift detection knows about it. And the customers can put rules around this to detect that drift. Also, also in some of the new additions include resource import. This allows you to import existing resources into CloudFormation. And finally, we've included Python and TypeScript as languages in which you can create these resources. So now we've talked about the registry, we talked a little bit about the modules, we've talked about additions, and now let's see a demo. So in this demo, I'm just going to create a module, and you're going to see how easily this can be done. So the first thing I'm going to do is go to the GitHub repository. And as you can see, it's fully documented on the requirements and how to get started. So the first thing I'm going to do is just copy this one-liner. And I'm going to open up my console. And I'm going to install all the requirements for the CloudFormation CLI. Now that I have the CloudFormation CLI installed, what I'm going to do is generate a project. And I can do that by running cfn CLI init. And I'm going to select module, and I'm going to give it a name. And this name of this module, the name of this module is going to be called Brian Terry, : S3, private bucket. And at the end of it, you have to include the module extension. Now that my project has been initialized, let's take a look and see what that looks like inside my IDE. So inside my IDE, as you can see, there are a couple files here that is created for us. One of them is a sample snippet and includes an S3 bucket. Well, I'm going to go through and just modify this snippet a little bit. Because in this module, what I want to do is just create an S3 bucket that I think should be a secure bucket. So in this simple example, I'm going to delete a lot of the boilerplate code. And for my secure bucket, I'm just going to have access control set to private. So now that I've got my snippet of CloudFormation templates, I can go ahead and start provisioning my module. But the first thing I want to do is actually show you what these modules look like in the console. So I'm going to go to the console and go here to under registry. And you can actually see those public and private types that we talked a little bit about, that I talked a little bit about in the presentation. As you can see, I don't have any private types or resources or modules or anything. So what I'm going to do is use a cfn CLI command called generate. And what generate is going to go through is verify my CloudFormation snippets. And it's verified, and now I can submit that module. So I'm going to use cfn CLI submit. Now this will just take a couple seconds, but what it's doing in the background is actually building all the infrastructure needed to submit this resource. This may include an S3 bucket inside my account, and which CloudFormation is able to obtain these assets for this module. So as you can see, this is a really quick process. If it submits, And now my resource is registered and it's ready to be used. So what I'm going to do is open up my project again, and I'm going to make a sample CloudFormation template to deploy my module. I'm going to call that deploy.json. Now in my deploy.json, what I'm going to do is it's real simple, just to copy this CloudFormation template fragment because it's very similar to the module that I created. The big modification I'm going to make with this is I'm actually going to change the type from AWS S3 bucket to my type. But the first thing I'm going to do is get rid of these properties that I will not need with this module. So we'll get rid of the access control value in the properties. And I'll get rid of this deletion policy because it's all contained inside my module. Now I'm going to name it Brian Terry S3 : private bucket. And then remember, you always have to have the module at the end to state that this is a module. So now I've got my CloudFormation templates. I'm ready to deploy my private bucket. So if we go back to the CloudFormation template, we'll see that my module has been registered. And as you can see that we have the schema for my module. And if we can look at other things such as input parameters, if I had those in there. And it also gives you a sample template in which you can use to test your module with. And this is very useful if you're in the early stages of developing your module and you just want to have a quick test. And it also lets you see, breaks out the resources that are actually within that module. So nothing's hidden. So essentially, if this is a 3-tier architecture, it will show that you're creating these, using these other AWS services. And again, if you wanted to use this example template as a quick test, you can just hit copy and deploy that in CloudFormation. So what I'm going to do is actually create a stack using that template that I just created in my IDE. So what I'm going to do is actually upload that template. I'm going to pick deploy.json. And now I'm actually going to deploy this CloudFormation template. So I'm going to call this sample stack and hit next. All right, I'm just going to leave these as defaults, and I'm actually going to deploy my CloudFormation template. I'm going to check these real quick and hit create stack. And now my stack is under provisioned. And this is going to take a little bit of a minute or two in order for CloudFormation to create my module. So we'll just give this a second or two. All right, so it looks like we've got some activity happening. As you can see, my bucket is under provision, so it's creating my resource. All right, we hit refresh, and as you can see, it's complete. And you can see that the resource created was my sample bucket, and it's based on AWS S3 type. And it would show outputs if I had those too. So that is a simple demonstration on how you create modules using the new module features in CloudFormation. So my name is Brian Terry, and thank you again for attending this session. Feel free to check out our documentation on the registry, resource types, and modules, and go out and build something. So thank you again for attending this presentation. If you would, just please complete the survey at the end. Thank you.